Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is the Wright Show, and you are Yousef Munayyer, and your new job is Executive Director of the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. And I wanted to talk to you about an op-ed you had in the New York Times today, in fact, and in the physical New York Times, no less, actually on paper.
That's right.
Where space is scarce. So congratulations on that. It's called Netanyahu's Win is Good for Palestine.
Right.
So I guess for starters, why don't you tell me why the victory of somebody whom not many Palestinians like is good for Palestine?
Sure. Well, obviously, the title was framed in a way to really make people ask that question and read the article, which goes into detail, and I think it got the desirable effect that it was looking for. Look, to be clear, I don't agree with or support any of the policies that Mr. Netanyahu stands for. However, looking at what were the plausible outcomes of this election and the known implications of those outcomes, being either a Netanyahu government or a government led by his most significant challenger, Isaac Herzog, who is essentially a newcomer on the international level. I think that the election of Netanyahu is unquestionably the better of the two outcomes, and here's why. If there was an Israeli leader running in this election who genuinely believed that the time has come to immediately dismantle the systematic oppression of Palestinians, which the military occupation is putting on them, and had also the electoral mandate to do that and could garner the electoral mandate to do that, then that person would unquestionably be the more preferable of the outcomes. But that person was not running. That person does not exist. Isaac Herzog takes a different position than Netanyahu on these issues, but there is little reason to believe that he would have the ability to deliver in any credible way. And I think that his election, had he been elected, would have created a perception of change without creating any change in reality. This would have led the international community to restart a conversation about a peace process that would inevitably fail.
I gather your feeling is that Israel, regardless of who is prime minister right now, is not prepared to make the kinds of concessions that would be deemed satisfactory by Palestinians as part of a two-state solution. Is that one way of stating the problem?
They are nowhere close to having a mandate necessary to make the minimum concessions to make a two-state solution plausible.
And just quickly before we get to why the Netanyahu victory is good news for you, what are some of the concessions that you think they are definitely not willing to make that no Israeli leader would have political support for?
Sure. Well, what I think we need to understand is that when it comes to Israeli public opinion, there's broad concepts and then there are, of course, the nuances. On broad concepts, the Israeli public, for the most part, supports the idea of separation from Palestinians in some form or another, and this often takes the shape of a two-state solution or the creation of a Palestinian state. But of course, the elements involved in that are a lot more tricky when you ask about them in public opinion polls. The vast majority does not support the division of Jerusalem, certainly not in any equitable way. The vast majority supports retaining the majority of the settlement blocks, including blocks that would make the viability of a Palestinian state in the West Bank impossible. The majority also is opposed overwhelmingly to the return of refugees in any way that satisfies the minimum Palestinian requirements on that issue. And also what Mr. Netanyahu has been able to do, I think, quite successfully over the last decade or so, is really push public opinion in a very hawkish direction on this nationalist question of the Jewish state, which has now, in Israeli public opinion, effectively moved the goalposts as a bargaining chip that Israelis present at the table anytime there is a conversation about peace moving forward, that Palestinians must recognize a Jewish state, which is something Palestinians, for many reasons, would simply not be able to do.
And to be clear, that's not just saying they have to recognize Israel's legitimacy as a state, which all kinds of nations do, but recognize it specifically as a Jewish state, which I think actually no nations do, because I think they've never really been asked to. But they're asking the Palestinians to go beyond normal diplomatic recognition and embrace the Jewish character of Israel.
Right, and it's a very odd sort of thing because the Israelis themselves do not define themselves as as the Jewish state of Israel. They define themselves in all international fora as the state of Israel. There are very few states that do define themselves in those terms. For example, the Islamic Republic of Iran is one of them. But Israel has never done that in the past. And so it's very odd that they would ask the Palestinians not just to recognize them officially as the Jewish state of Israel, but to do so when they themselves do not use that language.
Okay, so to summarize, you think there's a number of important concessions that the Israelis are not willing to make in any event that would be a prerequisite for a two-state solution from your point of view. In addition, Bibi has added some concessions he's demanding you think are not realistic. And I should say, by way of a newsflash, by the way, that, he had kind of famously said right before the election in a kind of a turnabout, or at least an apparent turnabout, there will be no Palestinian state while I'm prime minister. He is now, right before you and I started recording this on Thursday, he started walking that back. And one thing he's saying now is, well, what I meant is as long as they won't recognize us as a Jewish state and as long as X and Y and Z and so on. So anyway, okay, so that's where we are. Now, how is it that how does your movement move forward as a result of Bibi being reelected, as opposed to someone who at least would have appeared more accommodating?
Well, I think the important thing about his election is that it really solidifies the growing international perception of Israel as a pariah state. And I think that the election of Herzog would have done quite the opposite. It would have signaled change and hope, where I really don't think there was any, because I think it's not about the people at the top. It's really about entrenched interests in maintaining the occupation, which are at a variety of different levels of Israeli society. These things continue regardless to who's the prime minister or the party that is in charge. So I don't think, and I think the election actually proves this very clearly, that change is going to come from within Israel. I think change has to come from the outside, and it's going to involve the introduction of very significant pressure on the Israeli state and Israeli society to force them really to choose between two outcomes, either being a pariah state and being unwelcomed in the international community, or perpetual occupation, which is the choice that they are making now as a state. But currently, they continue to make the choice of perpetual occupation because the costs of occupation are extremely low. In fact,
well, wait, did you say they'll have to choose between pariah state and perpetual occupation? I thought those were one and the same. I mean, as long as they keep up the occupation, you're saying they'll be a pariah state, right?
Well, right now they're not a pariah state, and they are able to keep the occupation. That's precisely the problem. Okay. The pressure needs to grow to the point where that is a choice that they will have to make. And right now, they still enjoy significant ties throughout the international community. They still enjoy lots of protection from the United States and international fora, obviously billions of dollars in aid. All of this is allowing them to perpetuate an occupation while not paying any of the costs for it. In fact, many of the immediate costs of actually administering the occupation have been passed off to a subcontractor called the Palestinian Authority, which is now handling that for them, making it infinitely cheaper. When you look at defense consumption as a function of GDP in Israel, it has halved over the peace process period. They are able to carry out a military occupation of 4.5 million people, which is about half the population of Israeli citizens, for a very, very, very cheap price. So if they're reaping the rewards of occupation and paying no cost for it, why would they change the way they do things? There's no reason for them to.
Okay, so you envision that as a result of Bibi continuing to be the face of Israel, and in fact sounding more intransigent than ever, at least in the immediate leading up to the election, although again now he's kind of walking some of that back, you think that will help you and others sustain the momentum of what you see as an international movement to begin making Israel pay a price, right? I mean, there are signs that, I mean, there's this so-called BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and that is showing some signs of life on American campuses. Some foreign governments have done things right. So the basic scenario is that all of these forms of international pressure will continue and maybe even be accelerated as a result of his election?
Absolutely. You have to remember that one of the main reasons why these movements took off and were energized is because of the failure of the more traditional method, this peace process method, to deliver any returns on all of the investment that it's made in terms of time between Israelis and Palestinians. And so when you have that failure, people are going to look for other ways to make change. And it has largely been a civil society effort at this stage, but we're also starting to see it translate at the state level in certain places, more in Europe than in most others that matter right now. But that is a trend that I see continuing so long as it is very clear that Israel has no interest in peace. And I think there's nobody in Israel who makes that perception more clear to the international community than the face of Israeli intransigence, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu. So having him there has actually been a great thing for the movement to isolate Israel, because not only his policies, but also his particularly abrasive and arrogant style when dealing with the international community, which has helped burn bridges between Israel and leaders and diplomats around the world. And I think perhaps most importantly, with an Obama administration, which is clearly annoyed at minimum with Netanyahu.
Yeah. Now, in your op-ed piece in the New York Times, in addition to talking about this kind of prospect of growing pressure on Israel, you also talk about a kind of shift in what the kind of goal is from your point of view. You talk about transitioning from a land for peace concept to a land for rights concept. Okay, so what does that involve?
Well, it's a transition from a land for peace to rights for peace.
Sorry.
And I don't think it's a change in the goal, actually. The goal of the Palestinian national movement has always been reclamation of their rights. Statehood was a vehicle towards that end, or at least was supposed to be. That was the promise of the peace process to Palestinians. What became clear...
but can you clarify? Can you clarify that? How is it that statehood would have been only an intermediate step, and what would the ultimate goal have been?
Well, you have to remember that what Palestinians are after are the basic rights that are denied to them by the situation. This is equality for Palestinian citizens in Israel. This is self-determination for Palestinians living under occupation. And this is a right to return for Palestinian refugees who are denied that right. So these three very, very basic human rights are denied by this system. And so the idea of statehood was not the goal, not the end. It was the means to the end. It was the means to self-determination. But what has become clear over time is that the process of producing statehood actually undermined the movement towards reclaiming Palestinian rights, because we saw that the peace process acted only as a cover for the entrenchment of the occupation, not the other way around. And so the goal has not changed. The goal is still the reclamation of rights. The question is, what is the best vehicle now to use to get towards that end? And as statehood has increasingly proved to be a failure, That doesn't mean that one gives up on their goal. It just means you look for other avenues to get there. And I think that at this moment in time, a focus on a rights-based discourse and a civil rights movement is the one that offers the best opportunity, given the fact that Israel is not going to make any changes unless they come under serious pressure.
Okay, so and I want to talk a little further about the long-term end state, in particular about the right of return, because that's a particularly sticky issue, I think. But are you saying that then, in terms of the immediate avenue that Palestinians will pursue, are they going to shift from saying, give us a state in what is now the occupied territory, to saying, okay, forget about that, just let us vote in Israeli elections?
Well, I think many Palestinians have long given up the idea of a Palestinian state. There are some Palestinians that are still talking about this, and these tend to be folks in the leadership position who are essentially American clients and are relying on U.S. support and are not going to be able to distance themselves very significantly from U.S. policy. But if you ask Palestinians about whether or not they think that a Palestinian state will ever emerge, the vast majority of them say that it's never going to happen, or the chances are slim to none. This is the Palestinian public we're talking about. The leadership has a vested interest in maintaining that for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into at this point. But I think most Palestinians have realized for a long time that this is not going to happen. I mean, anyone who takes a drive through the West Bank and looks around at the reality there knows that there's no way to unscramble that egg. That's simply not going to happen. One can draw abstract lines on maps all day long, but the real change that needs to happen is significant. And the amount of pressure that would be needed to make that happen is far from being available right now.
Okay, I guess in a way the question I'm asking is there a shift? Are you saying that the kind of goal now is what's called a one-state solution?
I don't necessarily know if it's a pot of gold. I think that both the one-state outcome and the two-state outcome are not perfect. They're not utopian and should never be described as such. There's going to be a lot of challenges no matter which way this works out. In a two-state framework, a Palestinian state would at best, barely be a state, continue to be subject to Israeli whims, and would still be divided both geographically and probably politically as well. And in a one-state scenario, you're going to have plenty of challenges as well. None of these are really utopian outcomes. All of them are dystopian and dysfunctional. What needs to happen is to have a deeper exploration of how we can make them as functional as possible. And I think that it's clear that with all the work that has gone into trying to figure out how to achieve a two-state solution, that has not happened. And there needs to be more work done to understanding how there can be practical implementation of a one-state idea. And I think more work in that direction is needed. And it needs to be demystified, because I think a lot of people are afraid of the idea because they simply don't understand how it could work. But the idea of having a unitary state where there is pluralism and secularism is not some sort of revolutionary idea. And people would, Palestinians and Israelis would not be the first people to ever be able to do something like this. So I think it's just a question of understanding how the particular challenges of this case can be addressed by a new set of rules and constitutionalisms that would allow for a state like that to function. That's a conversation we haven't had yet, that we should have, but has largely been on hold precisely because so much of the focus has been on achieving a two-state outcome that everyone pretty much realizes is never going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me it's never going to happen. But as you said, the one-state scenario is kind of fraught with complexity, and there are issues really on both the Israeli side and on the the Palestinian side. I mean, the Palestinians in the West Bank. And to take the latter first, I've noticed that, at least in my experience, when you say to Palestinians in the West Bank, have you thought of just demanding the right to vote in Israeli elections and starting to hold demonstrations and saying, just give us basic human rights. After all, we are governed ultimately by the Israeli government. It purports to be a democracy. Then let us vote. And my thought has always been that that would actually, if there's one way to salvage a two-state solution, that's it, because it would terrify the Israelis into actually making more concessions than they've made on the two-state front. But in any event, what Palestinians have said to me is that's not a viable strategy, because to demand to vote in Israeli elections is to affirm the validity of the present system, which we don't affirm, right? That's a common reaction, right? We are not going to say that we want to be part of the Israeli system because it's inherently unjust and oppressive and Zionist or whatever, right?
Well, I mean, you could certainly understand why Palestinians would not want to be part of a system that oppresses them, but the idea would be that they would have a role in changing that system into something equitable and just, or at least more equitable and more just than the way that that system treats them today. I think you also have to remember that in terms of Palestinian public opinion on the political issue, it has largely been shaped by a discourse that's been dominated by leadership that has pushed the two-state framework for the past 20 to 30 years, if not more than that. So I think if that changes, you would also see a change in public opinion. But when you look at the nuances of public opinion on the Palestinian side, what you find is that, first of all, when we talk about Palestinians, we're talking about Palestinian stakeholders, which are not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but are also in Jerusalem, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the refugee camps as well. Most of the polls are really only conducted of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who have a vested interest in a two-state outcome in a way that Palestinian stakeholders outside of those territories do not. So I think that's something important to keep in mind as well. But even among that, there's not only a great skepticism of the viability of or likelihood of a two-state outcome, but there's also probably about 30% who would prefer the alternative outcome, which is the one-state outcome. And I think that's significant, considering all of these different factors which have skewed public opinion in the direction in which it's skewed.
Okay, then what about the other side, the Israeli side? You know, Israeli Jews are terrified of a one-state solution, in my experience. And, I don't think it's entirely irrational. I mean, they are right to think that there's a pretty intense sense of grievance among Palestinians in the West Bank, so it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination, I guess, for them to think that if there were a democracy in which Palestinians came to form a majority, then maybe they might not, the Jews might not be well treated, and there are various gradations of not being well treated. For starters, they want to hang on to their land, right, to their houses in Israel, and they know that there are a lot of claims on houses that were on property that was once inhabited by Palestinians, and so on. So, how big an obstacle do you think just this Israeli attitude is?
Well, it's very easy to understand why anybody, Israeli or otherwise, would fear something that they don't understand. I think that's a very common reaction. And I think one of the big problems is when we talk about the one-state outcome, as I mentioned earlier, there has been very little discussion of what practical implementation could look like. On the opposite end of that, on the two-state outcome, we have had libraries that can be filled with policy papers and documents and books and what have you of ideas for practical implementation of a two-state outcome. So people don't understand it. People don't understand how it could work. And serious work needs to be done in that area to demystify it. But, the easiest thing to do is disturb it, dismiss it as, some kind of scary existential threat to the population, when what it really is something that would fundamentally change the power structure. It wouldn't change people's existence. It wouldn't change the ability of the population to live there and to live freely. What it would change is who has access to power in the political system. And just as the white establishment in Selma, Alabama was very, very afraid of giving black people the vote. It's easy to understand why, people who are privileged by a system in Israel don't want to share power within that system. That doesn't make it morally right. And I don't think that, while we should work to demystify it and make it less of something to be afraid, we shouldn't let fears over losing dominance of political power allow people to remain in the situation they are in as second-class citizens or without any voting rights whatsoever in perpetuity.
And do you envision a one-state system in which specific ethnicities have kind of built-in guarantees that they would have certain forms of influence and power? I mean, a little like Lebanon, maybe, although in some ways that's not an auspicious example, maybe. But there's a recognition in Lebanon. There are these different ethnicities. They will share power in this way. The larger question is just, would there be this explicit recognition of different ethnic groups and formal guarantees that that there's structures in place to keep them from being overrun?
In every situation where we talk about these issues, we have to recognize that there are particular challenges in each case. Lebanon is a unique case. South Africa is a unique case. North Ireland is a unique case. All of these different cases have things in common, but they also have very important things that are different. And in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there are things that are very different that need to be addressed. And this includes the question that many Jews have about what would be the status of a potential one-state outcome as it relates to being a homeland and a safe haven for Jews around the world. I think this is a very legitimate question and one that needs to be explored in a serious discussion about constitutionalism. But that's a discussion that has to be had, and it's not a conversation that's happening. But obviously, I think, when we talk about forming a constitutional system and a constitution in general, it's done by bringing together the concerns of the different stakeholders involved to create a system of rules that works for everybody. And obviously, that system of rules has to work for everybody, or at least the vast majority, for it to work. And so the idea of creating a one-state solution in which half the population would be Jewish or more than half the population would be Jewish without taking into consideration the concerns of that population is obviously ludicrous. That's not something that can happen. But we can't move towards a different outcome until we start having that conversation in a radically different way than the way that it's being had right now.
Okay. I promised we'd get back to right of return, which normally is addressed in the context of a two-state solution. Of course, but that refers to the idea that every Palestinian who has a legitimate claim to having had, I guess, ownership of land or occupation of land in Israel proper prior to the creation of Israel, to one degree or another would have some claim on returning. Or, well, I probably got it wrong, but anyway, the idea is that some Palestinians would be allowed to return to Israel proper. Now, Israel refused to, in the last round of negotiations, discuss that even in the minimal, kind of token sense. In other words, where you would say, okay, nominally, certain Palestinians have a right to come and reclaim certain land, but as a practical matter, you can't get it all. So there would be a monetary compensation. So some might get a land, some small number, others would get monetary compensation instead or something like that. I mean, that's kind of the minimal version of it. And Israel wouldn't even talk about that. But what is the minimal version of it that you think would be acceptable to Palestinians? And I guess here we're back to kind of talking about a two-state context, maybe. But in any event, is that question too vague to address?
Well, obviously, this is a very complicated issue because the right of return is thought of both as an individual right and a collective right. And at the level of the individual right of individual refugees, it's a right that cannot be bargained away by any entity because it is a right in an individual capacity. As a sort of a collective right, there have been discussions about how it can be done within a two-state framework, or how it could be done in limited numbers of refugees coming back into their towns and villages and reuniting with their families and so on. But it's a big and complicated question that needs to be demystified. And when we're talking about making it work in a one-state framework, we're talking about a whole new set of possibilities in terms of practical implementations. One thing that most people don't understand, which I think is very important, is that the idea of a right of return, even on a significant scale, and it's not really clear if that would actually be the case should that right even be afforded, that it would be on a significant scale, is not going to result in some sort of displacement, massive displacement of Israelis. If you look at the geography and you understand where the land is and was in terms of where villages that were depopulated were, some 80% of the villages remain vacant land today. And so I think there is room to have a conversation about how practical implementation can be done with the really the minimum amount of major changes. And I think that is possible, but again, you have to start having that conversation. And when you enter a negotiating room and say we will have no discussion on right of return whatsoever, you can't even have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I just have two more questions. One is the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction, which I gather, just from glancing at the website of your associated with your current job as executive director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, I gather you're in some way associated with. One thing that has been said about that, mainly by critics of it, is that its explicit goal is a one-state solution, and it would not countenance a two-state solution. Now, I think as a practical matter, there are certainly people who support a boycott who would be fine with a two-state solution, but there has been this idea that in some sense the official goal of BDS is one state, and in the eyes of its critics, a particularly abhorrent version of a one-state solution, maybe. Is there any kind of official connection there, or is BDS, or is there even an official BDS movement, right? I mean, but I was going to say, is BDS kind of agnostic as to which outcome, two-state or one-state?
Yeah, I had written an article about this previously where I kind of discussed this in detail, and the title of that article was that BDS does not come with a map. And the reason I say that is because BDS is a rights-based movement. It's focused on the rights of Palestinians to return, to have self-determination, and to have equality within Israel if they live in Israel. And so I think that, these rights can be reclaimed in a one-state outcome and a two-state outcome. They could be reclaimed in some sort of confederate outcome or no-state outcome or whatever. It's really not about the contours of the borders. People have rights on different sides of borders, and just because they no longer live within a particular set of borders does not mean that they give up any rights that they had within them. So this is really not about the contours of an outcome. It's about the people's rights that need to be reclaimed. And so, I think one could have easily said about the divestment movement, in South Africa, that the goal of that was to bring down the government of South Africa. Well, sure, that's the idea here, is to radically change the way that power relationships exist, precisely because the way power relationships exist within the state today are very discriminatory and very unequal. So what we're talking about is very serious change to those power relationships. And I can see that happening in a two-state outcome or a one-state outcome. But the idea that these systems would perpetuate without any reclamation of the rights of people who are being denied is not something that we can stand by and accept.
Okay. Final question. There's been talk of action through the United Nations, and there's already been some action through the United Nations on the part of the Palestinian Authority, which, of course, you don't think of as a very good representative of actual Palestinian sentiment, but for better or worse, it's the authority, or maybe technically it's the PLO. And anyway, it's Abbas, I guess, in a sense, either way, who has taken stuff to the UN. And now there's talk of doing more of that. I mean, a kind of statehood has been implicitly affirmed kind of by the General Assembly, but the kind of statehood you would get from the Security Council of the UN has not been granted. There's been talk now of, in the wake of the Israeli election, going to the UN again for one thing or another, maybe to compel Israel to negotiate again for two states, which I think it's safe to say you would consider a lost cause. Maybe to get some clearer affirmation of statehood. There's also been talk of Obama being so fed up that he might quit protecting Israel at the UN. In other words, the United States might cease to use its veto power to stop at least certain kinds of resolutions that are not to Israel's liking. Is some of that stuff or all of that stuff consistent with your aims, or do you think some of it's misguided, or what?
I think the internationalization strategy, if you will, that the PLO has adopted over recent years, in some ways is useful, insofar as it increases the isolation of the Israeli state. I think it sends a message to Israel every time that there is a vote in the international community where Israel is on the same side of maybe 2 or 3 or at most 10 other nations, and the rest of the world is opposed. I think that tells the Israeli people that the vast majority of the world does not agree with the direction that Israel is going and the positions that it's taking. And I think that is helpful to that extent, that it contributes to international isolation. That is about as far as it goes, though, towards actually helping Palestinians reclaim their rights. But it allows leaders like Mahmoud Abbas and also leaders like Barack Obama, who are looking right now for something to do that is achievable. And this is one of the options that they have. For President Obama, obviously, using the vote at the United Nations is one thing that he can do that doesn't involve Congress and doesn't involve Congress objecting to in any way that they can prevent him from actually acting. So he might be thinking about perhaps breaking the taboo of unquestioned U.S. support for Israel at the United Nations, which, is not a major thing immediately, but to the extent that it changes the conversation about what's possible and not possible for the United States to do when it comes to pressure on Israel, I think it's important. And I think that would be a welcomed change as long as it's something that could be built upon to see increased pressure if the Israelis continue to fail to respond. For the Palestinians, it allows leaders like Abbas to say that they achieved something for a population which they have been promising self-determination for and statehood for so many years, but that has only seen the continued expansion of settlements around them. And so by being able to go to the international institutions, there's a piece of paper or an accomplishment or some sort of achievement, some sort of headline that Abbas can point to say, this is what we've been able to do, this is how we've advanced the cause. And for someone who is, in the waning years of his life, this is his legacy. And I think that's the way that he's thinking about it. In the long term, does it do much for advancing Palestinian rights? Not very much. But for leaders who are looking for something to do right now out of, I think, anger and disappointment, these are minor things that can be done that maybe can have, an effect on the discussion moving forward.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for taking the time. Again, the op-ed piece that was kind of the basis for this discussion is Netanyahu's Win is Good for Palestine by you, Yousef Munayyer, and you're executive director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Thanks a lot, Yousef, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
It's always good to be with you, Bob.
Okay, take care.